32. That was the official count of highly trained, Ivy League-educated, bilingual nannies who had fled the Hoyer penthouse in tears over the last 14 months. Some lasted a week, one lasted precisely 42 minutes. The Hoyer twins weren't just mischievous. They were psychological warfare experts, trapped in the bodies of 8-year-olds, determined to punish the world for their mother's abandonment and their billionaire father's absence. They had broken seasoned professionals and sent child psychologists into early retirement. No one could survive the terrors of 432 Park Avenue. No one. That is, until a 26-year-old diner waitress with zero childcare experience accidentally spilled iced coffee on a $5,000 suit, looked the devilish twins dead in the eye, and did the one thing no adult had ever dared to do. She called their bluff. The smell of burnt espresso and heavily sanitized tables was permanently etched into Sarah Jenkins's DNA. It was a brutal Tuesday afternoon at Sarah Beth's on Central Park South, the kind of lunch rush that made her regret every life choice that had led her to dropping out of her master's program at NYU. Her feet throbbed in her cheap non-slip shoes, and she was currently balancing 3 plates of eggs Benedict, a side of truffle fries, and a towering iced caramel macchiato. The bell above the door chimed, and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Even the clinking of silverware seemed to mute itself. Through the glass doors walked Arthur Hoyer, CEO of Hoyer Hayes Capital. Sarah recognized him immediately. His face was a permanent fixture in the Wall Street Journal and local New York gossip columns alike. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke navy Tom Ford suit, looking exhausted, gripping his phone to his ear. Trailing behind him was a frazzled-looking woman in a pristine trench coat, and 2 striking 8-year-old children, a boy and a girl with matching mop-tops of dark curls and calculating, icy blue eyes. Leo and Chloe Hoyer, the terrors of Manhattan's elite circles. Table for 4. Mr. Hoyer. The maitre d' scrambled, leading them to Sarah's section. From the moment they sat down, the chaos was orchestrated and lethal. While Arthur barked orders into his phone about the impending Brookfield Properties merger, the twins went to work on their current nanny, a terrified-looking woman named Genevieve. First, it was the water glasses. Chloe subtly tipped hers, soaking Genevieve's silk scarf. Then, Leo began a rhythmic, high-pitched tapping on the mahogany table with a butter knife, when Genevieve leaned in to whisper a frantic plea for them to stop. Leo sneezed deliberately and wetly right into her face. Sarah approached with her notepad, feeling a sudden pang of pity for the nanny. "Welcome to Sarah Beth's. Can I get you started with some beverages?" Genevieve burst into tears. She stood up so fast her chair crashed to the hardwood floor. "I can't. I simply can't do this anymore. Keep your hazard pay. Mr. Hoyer," she sobbed, throwing a crumpled wad of tissues onto the table. "They are monsters." With that, the 30-second nanny sprinted out the front doors, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Arthur slowly lowered his phone, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at the twins, who were currently sharing a triumphant, high-fiving glance. "Leo, Chloe, what did I say about terrorizing the staff?" he asked, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with bone-deep fatigue. "We didn't do anything." "Father," Chloe said, blinking innocently. "Genevieve is just highly unstable," Sarah sighed, wiping down the edge of the table. "Right. And the salt shaker you unscrewed so it would dump all over her quiche was just a structural failure." The twins froze, their heads snapping up to look at the waitress. No service worker ever spoke to them. They were usually invisible. "Excuse me," Arthur said, looking at Sarah for the first time. "The salt shaker," Sarah said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "She loosened the cap while you were looking at the menu, and your son has a packet of hot sauce currently hidden up his sleeve, probably waiting for the replacement nanny to arrive." Leo's jaw dropped. He instinctively grabbed his left sleeve. "I'll take that," Sarah said, holding out her hand. When Leo hesitated, glaring at her with a furious scowl, she didn't flinch. She just raised an eyebrow, channeling every ounce of exhaustion from her double shift. "Kid, I work for tips, and I've been on my feet for 9 hours. You think your little parlor tricks scare me? Hand over the hot sauce, or I'm bringing you a plate of steamed broccoli for lunch and nothing else." Leo, genuinely shocked by the sheer audacity of this peasant in an apron, slowly dropped the hot sauce packet into her palm. "Good," Sarah said. "Now, what do you want to eat? And if either of you orders the pancakes just to throw them at each other like you did at the plaza last week." "Yes. I read the tabloids. I will personally give you a rag and make you mop the floor." "Understood." Chloe narrowed her eyes. "You can't talk to us like that. Our father is a billionaire." "Your father," Sarah said, leaning in slightly, "is hungry. And so am I. So, burgers or chicken tenders?" "Chicken tenders," they mumbled in unison, completely derailed by her refusal to coddle them. Arthur Hoyer sat in stunned silence. He had watched top-tier child psychologists try to use positive reinforcement, negotiation, and bribery, all failing miserably. This girl in a stained apron had dismantled them in 40 seconds. "I'll take the steak frites," Arthur said softly, his eyes studying Sarah intensely. When Sarah returned with the drinks, she was balancing a heavily loaded tray. Suddenly, a chaotic group of tourists pushed past her, jarring her elbow. The tray tilted. Time slowed down. The massive iced caramel macchiato tipped over the edge and cascaded directly onto Arthur Hoyer's lap. The restaurant gasped. Sarah froze, the empty tray dangling in her hand. "Well," she thought. "That's it. I'm fired. I can't pay rent. I'm moving back to Ohio." Arthur stood up, ice cubes clattering onto the floor, his custom suit ruined. He looked at the brown stain spreading across his trousers. Then he looked at Sarah, who was already reaching into her apron for a pathetic, useless stack of napkins. "I am so sorry. Mr. Hoyer," she stammered, panic finally piercing her cool exterior. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning. What is your name?" Arthur interrupted, his voice calm. Sarah Jenkins. Please, my Bendessa, my manager is going to kill me." "Sarah Jenkins," Arthur repeated. He glanced at his children, who were quietly drinking their apple juice, too intimidated by Sarah to make a scene out of the spilled coffee. It was a miracle. "How much do you make here in a year?" "Sarah," she blinked, totally thrown by the question. Maybe 40,000 if the tips are good." Arthur pulled a sleek, black business card from his unruined jacket pocket and placed it on the table. "I will pay you $150,000 a year, with full benefits, a private suite in my residence, and a signing bonus to cover your rent for the next 6 months. If you can keep my children from getting expelled from another private school and stop them from torturing my staff, the job is yours." Sarah stared at the card. Hoyer Hayes Capital. Arthur Hoyer. "I don't have a background in child development," Sarah said, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm a waitress." "No," Arthur said, tossing a $100 bill on the table for the drinks. "You're the first person I've seen in 2 years who doesn't treat my children like ticking time bombs or fragile porcelain. Be at 432 Park Avenue tomorrow at 8. Morheim. Pack your bags. The elevator at 432 Park Avenue didn't have buttons. It required a biometric scan. When the polished brass doors glided open on the 84th floor, Sarah stepped into a world that felt less like a home and more like a modern art museum. The floors were stark white marble, the walls adorned with original Rothkos, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. Take off your shoes. Sarah jumped. Standing in the foyer was an older woman with iron-grey hair pulled back into a severe bun, wearing a tailored black dress. This was Beatrice, the head housekeeper, who had survived 3 decades with the Hoyer family by remaining entirely unflappable. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said, slipping off her worn sneakers. Beatrice looked at Sarah's practical jeans and oversized sweater with thinly veiled disdain. "Mr. Hoyer informed me of your unconventional hiring. I give you until Thursday. The last one with Spirit lasted until Wednesday. But you seem stubborn." "Nice to meet you too," Sarah murmured, following the housekeeper down a sprawling hallway. "The twins are in the West Wing," Beatrice instructed. They were expelled from the Dalton school last month after hacking into the principal's email and cancelling the winter recital. They currently have tutors from 9 to noon. Your job is to keep them alive, keep them quiet, and keep them out of Mr. Hoyer's home office. Dinner is at exactly 6. Do not be late. Beatrice abandoned her in front of a heavy oak door. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted her posture, and pushed the door open. She walked into a sprawling playroom that looked like a high-end toy store had exploded, but the room was suspiciously quiet. Too quiet. Sarah stopped just inside the doorway. She scanned the room. A massive dollhouse, a sprawling Lego city, a massive flat-screen TV. No kids. Then she noticed the slight shadow above the doorway. She stepped back just as a heavy, industrial-sized bucket of glitter and sticky glue swung down from a meticulously rigged pulley system, crashing onto the exact spot she had been standing seconds before. A collective groan echoed from behind the velvet curtains. Leo and Chloe stepped out, looking profoundly disappointed. "Your timing was off," Sarah said casually, analyzing the rope tied to the door handle. "You gave it too much slack. Next time, use a tighter tension knot so it drops immediately upon the door's opening, not a full 2 seconds later." The twins stared at her. They had expected her to scream, to cry, to run to Beatrice. Instead, she was critiquing their engineering. "You're not mad?" Chloe asked, crossing her arms defensively. "I'm annoyed you wasted good glitter," Sarah replied, walking over to an armchair and sitting down. "But mostly, I'm disappointed. I was told you two were criminal masterminds. This is rookie stuff. Home Alone was filmed 30 years ago. Get new material." Leo's eyes flashed with a competitive spark. "We can do worse." "I'm sure you can. But here is the new deal," Sarah said, leaning forward. "You guys are bored. You miss your mum. You want your dad's attention. I get it. Acting out is the easiest way to get adults to look at you, even if they're yelling." Chloe stiffened. "Don't talk about our mother." The air in the room instantly grew heavy. Their mother, a French socialite, had walked out 3 years ago to find herself in Ibiza and hadn't called since. It was the open wound that drove every ounce of their terrible behavior. "Fair enough," Sarah said softly, validating the boundary. "We don't have to talk about her. But I am not going to yell at you. I'm not going to tattle on you to your father. If we have a problem, we handle it between us. But if you try to sabotage my day, I will make yours incredibly boring. Understood. You can't punish us, Leo smirked. Dad fires anyone who punishes us. I don't need to punish you, Sarah smiled sweetly. I just need to enforce natural consequences. Speaking of which, since there is glue and glitter all over the entryway, you two are going to clean it up before the tutors get here. No, Chloe said simply. Okay. Sarah shrugged. She pulled out her phone, sat back, and began scrolling through her email. 10 minutes passed. The twins stood there, waiting for the escalation. It never came. We aren't cleaning it, Leo reiterated. That's fine. Sarah didn't look up. But the Wi-Fi password in this wing has been changed. I had the IT guy do it before I arrived. You can have the new password when the floor is spotless. Panic crossed Leo's face. He grabbed his iPad. No connection, he whispered in horror. You're a monster. Chloe gasped. I'm a waitress, Sarah corrected, and I'm used to dealing with people much tougher than you. The mop is in the utility closet. You have 20 minutes. For the first time in their lives, the Hoyer twins were outplayed, grumbling under their breath. They dragged a bucket and mop into the playroom. Sarah watched them from the corner of her eye, a tiny smile playing on her lips. It was a small victory, but the war had only just begun. A month passed, and the penthouse remained in a state of tense, negotiated peace. Beatrice was visibly shocked when Thursday came and went without Sarah packing her bags. Arthur Hoyer was even more surprised when he checked his bank statements and saw no extortionate settlements paid out to traumatized childcare workers. Sarah was learning the rhythm of the twins beneath their prickly, defensive exteriors. Leo was a brilliant, anxious kid who loved astrophysics, and Chloe was a sensitive, fiercely protective sister with a talent for classical piano. Sarah stopped treating them like problems to be solved and started treating them like human beings. They read books together. They went to Central Park without a security detail, to Arthur's initial horror, though Sarah insisted on normalcy, and they even baked cookies in the industrial kitchen, much to the chef's dismay. But the fragile peace was shattered the week of the Hoyer Hayes annual charity gala. Arthur was hosting a massive, high-stakes pre-gala dinner at the Penthouse. Executives from Goldman Sachs and BlackRock were attending. But more importantly to the twins, Arthur was bringing his new fiancée, Victoria. Victoria was a 28-year-old former model turned lifestyle guru. She was dripping in new money, wore exclusively white cashmere, and looked at the twins as if they were a disease she might catch. She had already made it clear to Arthur, loud enough for the children to hear, that she believed a strict boarding school in Switzerland, La Rosie, was the only civilized option for them once they were married. On the afternoon of the dinner, the penthouse was buzzing with caterers. Sarah found the twins huddled in the library, a blueprint of the dining room spread across the mahogany desk. All right. What's the target? Sarah asked, leaning against the doorframe. The twins jumped, scrambling to cover the papers. Nothing, Leo said quickly. Sarah walked over and moved Leo's hands. It was a schematic of the dining room's air conditioning vents. Next to it was a bag of pure, concentrated skunk essence, a novelty item you could buy online, designed to clear a room in seconds. You're going to drop this into the HVAC system during the appetizer course, Sarah deduced, her eyes wide. Leo, that will ruin the entire penthouse. It will sink into the walls. It's a multi-million-dollar repair. We don't care, Chloe shouted. sudden tears welling in her eyes. She hates us. Victoria wants to send us away. She told Dad we were damaged goods last night. We heard her. If she ruins our home, we'll ruin her dinner. Sarah's heart broke. She sat down on the leather sofa and pulled both kids toward her. Surprisingly, they didn't resist. Chloe buried her face in Sarah's shoulder, crying quietly. "I know," Sarah said softly, stroking Chloe's hair. "I know she's awful, but this won't hurt Victoria. This will hurt your dad. He needs this merger to go through. And if you do this, you're just giving Victoria exactly what she wants, proof that you're out of control and need to be sent away." Leo looked up, his lip trembling. "But we have to do something. She can't win." Sarah looked at the skunk essence, then at the tear-stained faces of the kids she had grown to fiercely protect. A dangerous, incredibly unprofessional idea began to bloom in her mind. "You're right. She can't win," Sarah said slowly. "But dropping a biological weapon on Goldman Sachs executives is bad strategy. We need a targeted strike, something that only affects Victoria, exposes her to your dad, and leaves you two entirely blameless." Leo's eyes widened. You want to help us?" "I'm your nanny," Sarah said, a wicked glint in her eye. "My job is to look out for your best interests. Now, tell me, is Victoria bringing her new dog tonight?" "Yes," Chloe sniffled. "That horrible little teacup Pomeranian she carries in her Birkin bag. Francois." "Perfect," Sarah said. "Here is the new plan." That evening, the penthouse dining room was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers gleamed over a table set for 20. Arthur sat at the head, desperately trying to charm the stoic banking executives. Victoria sat to his right, wearing a blindingly expensive diamond necklace and looking bored, occasionally feeding caviar to Francois the Pomeranian, who was perched on a velvet stool beside her. Sarah stood quietly by the kitchen doors, keeping a watchful eye on the twins, who were sitting at a small side table, eating their dinner with angelic perfection. The main course was served. The conversation was incredibly tense, centering on the delicate financials of the merger. Arthur needed this to go smoothly. Suddenly, Victoria let out a blood-curdling shriek. The entire table fell silent. The executives stared. Arthur jumped up. "Victoria, what is it?" Victoria pushed her chair back violently, pointing a shaking, manicured finger into her open $100,000 crocodile Birkin bag resting on the floor. "There's a rat!" she screamed hysterically. "A massive, filthy rat in my bag." Arthur rushed over, peering inside. "Victoria, calm down. Let me see." Suddenly, Francois the Pomeranian, sensing a threat, dove headfirst into the Birkin bag. A chaotic scuffle ensued inside the expensive leather. Victoria shrieked again, grabbing the bag and dumping its contents directly onto the pristine dining table. Out tumbled makeup, credit cards, Francois, and a sleek, incredibly realistic, remote-controlled toy mouse. It zipped across the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass, which shattered, splashing red wine all over a BlackRock executive's shirt. The table erupted into chaos. The executive stood up, furious. "Who is responsible for this?" Victoria screeched, her face red, completely losing her refined aristocratic persona. "It was those little brats, I know it was." She pointed furiously at Leo and Chloe, who were staring at her with wide, perfectly innocent eyes. "Victoria, please," Arthur said, mortified, trying to apologize to the executives while grabbing the toy mouse. They are sitting 20 feet away. They planned this. They are psychopathic little freaks, Victoria yelled, her voice echoing off the marble walls. I told you, Arthur. Send them to the asylum in Switzerland where they belong. I will not have my life ruined by your defective offspring. The silence that followed was deafening. The executives looked intensely uncomfortable. Arthur stood frozen, the toy mouse in his hand, staring at the woman he was supposed to marry. Sarah stepped forward from the shadows. Actually, Ms. Victoria, Sarah said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. The twins didn't do anything. She held up a small black remote control. I was cleaning out the playroom earlier and found this in the couch cushions. I must have accidentally leaned on the joystick in my apron pocket. It was entirely my fault. I am so sorry. Victoria glared at Sarah, then sneered at Arthur. You see, your staff is as incompetent as your children. Fire her immediately and call a car. I am leaving. Arthur looked at Victoria, seeing the venom in her eyes. He looked at the executives, who were clearly appalled by Victoria's outburst. Then he looked at his children, who were shrinking back in their chairs, hurt by the words, defective offspring. Finally, he looked at Sarah, who was holding the remote, taking the fall to protect his kids. Arthur's expression hardened. The billionaire CEO finally stepped up. You don't need to call a car. Victoria, Arthur said, his voice ice cold. Beatrice will have your coats brought up. We are done. Victoria gasped, her face draining of color. Arthur, you can't be serious. I have never been more serious, Arthur said. Leave. As Victoria stormed out, dragging a bewildered Francois behind her, the penthouse was left in a stunned quiet. The executives coughed awkwardly. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, looking at the mess on the table. Gentlemen, Arthur said wearily, turning to the bankers. I apologize for the disruption. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on my children. Arthur walked over to the small table. He knelt down so he was eye level with Leo and Chloe. For the first time in a long time, he really looked at them. Are you two okay? Leo nodded slowly. Chloe reached out and hugged her dad's neck. Arthur held onto her tightly, closing his eyes. When he finally stood up, he walked over to Sarah, who was still holding the remote. Accidentally leaned on the joystick, huh? Arthur asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. Must have been a heavy pocket, Sarah replied, not breaking eye contact. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Arthur's mouth. Thank you, Sarah. Just doing my job. Mr. Hoyer. But as Sarah looked over at the twins, who were grinning at her with fierce loyalty, she knew the truth. She wasn't just a nanny anymore. She was part of the family, and the real drama was only just beginning. The transition from the stifling heat of a Manhattan July to the ocean-breezed sanctuary of the Hoyer estate in Southampton felt like stepping onto another planet. For the first time in their lives, the twins weren't spending their summer locked in a penthouse with a rotating cast of terrified nannies. They were outside. They were getting sunburns, scraping their knees on the gravel driveway, and learning how to surf at Cooper's Beach. Arthur Hoyer had changed, too. The fallout from the Victoria disaster had acted as a massive wake-up call. He was delegating more at the firm, taking the Sikorsky helicopter out to the Hamptons on Thursday evenings instead of Saturday mornings. He was actually present. The impenetrable billionaire had softened, often found sitting on the wraparound porch with a cup of black coffee, quietly watching Sarah teach Chloe how to properly dig for steamer clams in the muddy shallows of the bay. The warfare had ceased. The Hoyer household was, miraculously, happy, which, in the brutal ecosystem of high society, meant a storm was inevitably brewing. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a silver Mercedes G-Wagon blowing past the front security gates. Sarah was in the front yard, a garden hose in hand, currently engaged in a ruthless water war with Leo and Chloe. They were soaked, laughing hysterically, the grass turning into a slippery mud pit. The laughter died the second the heavy door of the G-Wagon slammed shut. Stepping onto the crushed oyster-shell driveway was a woman who looked like she had just walked off the runway of Paris Fashion Week. She wore oversized Celine sunglasses, a flowing white linen jumpsuit, and radiated the distinct, intoxicating scent of Baccarat Rouge 540. Leo dropped his water gun. It hit the grass with a dull thud. Chloe froze, her eyes widening in a mixture of profound shock and a deeply ingrained, childish hope. It was Camille, their mother, the woman who had boarded a private jet to Spain 3 years ago with a cryptic note about spiritual exhaustion and hadn't called on a single birthday since. "Mes chérie," Camille purred, removing her sunglasses. She opened her arms, flashing a brilliant, surgically perfected smile. "Maman is home," before the twins could move. The heavy oak front door of the estate swung open. Arthur stepped out, still holding his reading glasses, all the color instantly drained from his face. "Camille," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "What are you doing here?" "Arthur, darling, you look tense," she replied, gliding past the muddy children without actually hugging them, terrified of ruining her pristine linen. She stopped a few feet from Arthur. "I heard through the grapevine well. Actually through page 6 that you dumped that dreadful Victoria creature. I realized it was time to come back, to my family." Sarah stood silently, the hose still dripping onto the grass. She watched the twins. Chloe looked completely devastated by the denied hug, her small shoulders slumping. Leo's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening into the familiar, icy glare he used to reserve for the nannies. Camille finally turned her gaze toward the yard, her eyes landing on Sarah's wet t-shirt, messy bun, and muddy sneakers. She offered a tight, condescending smile. "And you must be the summer help. Be a dear and fetch my luggage, will you? The driver is union and refuses to carry anything over 20 pounds. "She's not the help," Leo snapped, stepping in front of Sarah protectively. "She's Sarah." Camille raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Sarah, how quaint." "Well, Sarah, I prefer sparkling water with a twist of lime. Bring it to the drawing room. Arthur and I need to have a private chat." Arthur looked like he was vibrating with restrained fury. He turned to Sarah, his eyes pleading. "Take the kids to the beach house, now." For the next 3 hours, Sarah sat on the deck of the guest house with the twins, wrapped in beach towels, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the shore. The silence was suffocating. "She doesn't want us," Leo said suddenly, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She just ran out of money. Dad's lawyers always said she'd come back when the divorce settlement ran dry." "Don't say that," Chloe yelled, shoving her brother. "She said she came back for us. She didn't even hug you, Chloe," Leo yelled back, his voice cracking. "She looked at you like you were garbage." "Hey!" Sarah intervened sharply, pulling them both into her arms. "Stop it, both of you. The adults are going to handle this. You two are a team. Remember, we don't turn on each other." When they finally returned to the main house, Camille was gone, and Arthur was sitting in his study, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring blankly at the wall. Sarah knocked softly on the doorframe. "Are they asleep?" Arthur asked, not looking up. "Watching a movie," Sarah replied, stepping into the room. "What happened?" "Arthur." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "She wants them back. She claims she's had a spiritual awakening in Ibiza and is now fully equipped to be a mother. She's threatening to file for sole custody in New York Supreme Court, citing my demanding work schedule and the fact that I left my children in the primary care of a diner waitress with no educational credentials." Sarah felt a cold pit form in her stomach. Can she do that? Can she win? "She doesn't want to win," Arthur said, finally looking at her, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "She wants a payout. She demanded $50 million to drop the custody suit and go back to Europe. If I fight her in court, she'll drag the children through a highly publicized psychological evaluation. She'll leak stories to the press. She will tear their lives apart just to force my hand." Sarah thought about Chloe's hopeful face. She thought about Leo's fierce, protective stance. She thought about the 32 nannies, the trauma, the absolute mess Camille had left behind. "So, what are you going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "I'm going to call my bankers," Arthur said softly. "I'm going to pay her. I can't let her destroy them again." Sarah walked out of the study, her mind racing. Paying Camille wouldn't solve the problem. It would only put a price tag on the children's peace. It would teach Camille that she could return every time she needed a deposit. Sarah walked into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee. She wasn't a billionaire. She didn't have a law degree from Harvard, but she had survived 7 years working double shifts in Midtown Manhattan. She knew a scammer when she saw one. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to extort her kids. Over the next week, Camille set up camp at the Maidstone Hotel in East Hampton, using it as a luxurious staging ground for her psychological warfare. She demanded daily, supervised visits with the twins. Every afternoon was a masterclass in manipulation. Camille would show up with a paparazzi photographer conveniently hiding in the bushes, capturing her handing the twins expensive, thoughtless gifts, a vintage Cartier watch for Leo, a miniature Prada bag for Chloe. Then, the moment the cameras were gone, she would retreat to her phone, pacing the gardens, speaking in rapid, hushed French. The kids were regressing rapidly. Chloe started having night terrors again, waking up screaming that her mother was leaving her on an airplane. Leo retreated into his shell, becoming silent, combative, and refusing to eat. All the progress Sarah had made over the last 4 months was disintegrating before her eyes. On Thursday afternoon, while Camille was forcing Chloe to pose for a selfie by the pool, Sarah sat on the patio, watching Camille's discarded Birkin bag resting on a chaise lounge. Camille's phone, sitting precariously on the edge of the bag, kept lighting up with notifications. Sarah wouldn't normally stoop to snooping, but this wasn't normal. This was war. She casually walked over, pretending to collect empty lemonade glasses. She glanced at the screen. The messages were coming in rapidly from a contact named Marcello, Monaco. Sarah's high school French was rusty, but the all-caps text was universal. "Pay now or we take the boat." Another message followed. "The investors are furious. You have 1 week." Sarah's eyes narrowed. Investors, furious, seizing a boat. Camille hadn't had a spiritual awakening. She had committed financial fraud, and dangerous people were collecting her debts. Sarah immediately sought out the one person in the house with the skills to dig deeper. She found Leo in his bedroom, staring blankly at a textbook. Leo, Sarah said, closing the door behind her and locking it. I need your help. The kind of help that got you expelled from Dalton. Leo looked up, a spark of life returning to his dull eyes. What do you mean? Your mother's phone has been blowing up with messages from a guy named Marcello in Monaco about angry investors and a seized yacht, Sarah said, sitting on the edge of his bed. I need to know everything about Camille's life in Ibiza. Can you trace her? Leo didn't hesitate. He pulled his heavily modified Alienware laptop from under his bed. His fingers flew across the keyboard. She's not exactly careful with her digital footprint, Leo muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. She uses the same password for everything. It used to be my birthday, but she changed it to Ibiza Queen 2 years ago. Within 45 minutes, the 8-year-old hacker and the former waitress had uncovered a staggering web of deceit. Camille had been running a luxury concierge Ponzi scheme in the Mediterranean. She had taken millions from wealthy European socialites, promising exclusive access to villas and yachts that didn't exist, and funneled the money to fund her own lavish lifestyle. Now, the scheme had collapsed. The authorities in Monaco were circling, and her private creditors were threatening her life. She didn't want the kids. She needed Arthur's $50 million to stay out of a French prison. Print it all, Sarah said, her voice like steel. Every bank statement, every email, every text. Sarah, Leo said, his voice trembling slightly as the printer whirred to life. Are you going to send my mum to jail? Sarah stopped, looking at the little boy who had already been through so much. She knelt down and put her hands on his shoulders. No, Leo, I'm going to make sure she leaves you and your sister alone forever. I promise. The next morning, Camille arrived at the estate an hour early, wearing a massive sun hat and demanding to take the twins to St. Ambreas for brunch. Arthur was in his study, finalizing the massive wire transfer with his bankers, looking utterly defeated. Sarah intercepted Camille in the grand foyer before she could reach the children's wing. They aren't going to brunch with you, Camille, Sarah said smoothly. Crossing her arms, Camille laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Excuse me. You are a glorified babysitter. Step aside before I have Arthur fire you. Arthur's busy, Sarah said, pulling a thick manila folder from behind her back. He's currently wiring $50 million to your Cayman Islands account. But I thought before he hit send, we should have a little chat about Marcello in Monaco. Camille stopped dead in her tracks. The smug, aristocratic mask slipped, revealing pure, unadulterated panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do, Sarah said, walking slowly toward her, forcing Camille to back up toward the heavy front doors. You owe roughly 12 million euros to some very unsavory people. The Monaco police are drafting a warrant for wire fraud regarding your fake villa rentals. You came back here to extort your ex-husband so you could pay off the mob and flee to a non-extradition country. Camille's breathing grew shallow. You're bluffing. You're a pathetic little waitress. You don't know anything. Sarah opened the folder and held up a printed stack of emails, bank transfers, and translated text messages. I know how to read, and I know how to deal with people who try to skip out on the bill. Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Here is what is going to happen. Camille, you are going to walk out that door. You are going to text Arthur and tell him you withdraw your custody claim entirely. You will sign a legally binding document relinquishing all parental rights. You can't make me do that, Camille hissed, her hands shaking. "I'll tell the press. If you don't do exactly as I say," Sarah interrupted, her eyes blazing. "I will hand this folder over to Arthur's legal team. They won't just block the 50 million. They will forward this dossier directly to Interpol and the federal authorities in Monaco. You won't be fleeing to a beach, Camille. You'll be wearing an orange jumpsuit by Tuesday." Camille stared at the girl in the jeans and sneakers. She had underestimated her entirely. She had expected to fight a polished billionaire, not a street-smart brawler who had nothing to lose. Tears of rage and defeat welled in Camille's eyes. She snatched the folder from Sarah's hands, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You ruined everything," Camille spat venomously. "No," Sarah corrected quietly. "I cleaned up your mess. Now, get out of my house." Camille turned on her heel, pushed open the heavy oak door, and practically sprinted to her G-Wagon. The tires squealed on the crushed oyster shells as she sped out of the gates, never to return. Sarah stood in the quiet foyer, her heart pounding against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her veins. "Sarah!" She turned around. Arthur was standing in the doorway of his study, holding his phone, looking utterly bewildered. "Camille just texted me," Arthur said, his voice thick with disbelief. "She said she's dropping the suit. She's giving me full, undisputed custody. She's gone." He looked at Sarah, noticing the intense expression on her face. "What did you do?" Sarah took a deep breath, smoothing down her shirt. She walked over to the billionaire, a small, exhausted smile breaking across her face. "I handled a difficult customer. Mr. Hoyer," Sarah said softly. "Now, if you don't mind, I promised Chloe I'd teach her how to make pancakes, and we are entirely out of syrup." Arthur stared at her, a profound realization dawning in his eyes. He didn't just owe her his children's happiness. He owed her his entire life. The transition from the sun-drenched sanctuary of the Hamptons back to the relentless, concrete energy of autumn in Manhattan was usually a brutal reality check for the Hoyer family. Historically, September meant a return to grueling board meetings for Arthur, a string of fired tutors, and a renewed campaign of terror from the twins. But this year, the crisp fall air brought a bizarre, unprecedented tranquility to the 84th floor of 432 Park Avenue. Leo and Chloe had been accepted into the prestigious Trinity School on the Upper West Side, and for the first 6 weeks, not a single fire alarm was pulled. Leo had joined the robotics club, channeling his destructive engineering skills into building remote-controlled battlebots. Chloe was taking advanced piano lessons at the Juilliard School's pre-college division, her night terrors having completely vanished the day Camille's G-Wagon sped out of their lives. At the center of this domestic miracle was Sarah. She no longer felt like an employee. She was the gravitational pull that kept the Hoyer universe from collapsing. But as the family thrived inside the penthouse, a storm was brewing outside of it. High society despises a vacuum, and it despises an interloper even more. It started with a blind item on the infamous celebrity gossip account, Doomoy, followed swiftly by a scathing double-page spread in Page 6. The headline read, "The Billionaire and the Barista. Has Arthur Hoyer been brainwashed by the help paparazzi? Began camping outside the Trinity School gates." When Sarah took the kids to Woolman Rink in Central Park for Sunday ice skating, she was blinded by camera flashes. Whispers echoed through the halls of the Knickerbocker Club and the dining room at Balthazar. The narrative was viciously crafted by Victoria's humiliated friends, and Arthur's jealous rivals Sarah Jenkins was a master manipulator. A gold-digging diner waitress who had successfully driven away a suitable fiancé and systematically alienated the children from their biological mother to secure the Hoyer fortune for herself. Sarah tried to ignore it. She had thick skin, but the pressure began to fracture the fragile peace when the board of directors at Hoyer Hayes Capital decided to intervene. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while the twins were at school, Beatrice escorted a man into the penthouse. It was Richard Harrington, the senior board member of Arthur's firm. Richard was a man carved from old money, clad in a bespoke charcoal suit, carrying a silver-handled umbrella. He looked at the penthouse as if he owned it, and he looked at Sarah as if she were a stain on the marble floor. Arthur was in his home office, reviewing the prospectus for a massive, multi-billion-dollar tech IPO. He looked up, surprised, as Richard bypassed Beatrice and walked straight in, deliberately leaving the heavy mahogany doors open so Sarah, who was organizing the library across the hall, could hear every word. "Richard, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Arthur asked, closing his laptop. "I'll be brief." "Arthur," Richard said, his voice carrying the sharp, unyielding tone of a Wall Street veteran. "The board is deeply concerned. We are 3 weeks away from the largest IPO this firm has ever launched. Our institutional investors' vanguard, Fidelity, are looking for stability, and right now, you are a walking tabloid scandal." "My personal life is not the board's concern," Arthur replied, his voice dropping an octave. "It is when it affects the stock price," Richard snapped back. "You have a 26-year-old high school graduate running your household. The press is calling her a grifter. There are rumors you're sleeping with the hired help. It makes you look weak. Arthur, it makes you look easily manipulated. The investors need to see the Arthur Hoyer who ruthlessly acquired Brookfield Properties, not a love-struck fool being played by a girl from Ohio." In the library, Sarah stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the spine of a first-edition Dickens novel so hard her knuckles turned white. "What are you suggesting?" "Richard." Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet, like the ocean drawing back before a tsunami. "Fire her," Richard demanded flatly. "Today, pay her off, make her sign a titanium-clad NDA, and hire a proper governess from Norland College in London. Someone with a master's degree in early childhood development. Someone who knows their place. If you don't clean house, Arthur, the board is prepared to call a vote of no confidence." Silence hung heavy in the penthouse. Sarah didn't wait to hear Arthur's response. The old, familiar panic of being the expendable worker bee flooded her chest. She quietly slipped out of the library, retreated to her private suite, and pulled her beat-up canvas duffel bag from the top of the closet. Richard was right. She was a liability. She had saved the kids. But now, her presence was threatening to destroy the empire their father had built for them. She had done her job. It was time to clock out. Sarah was halfway through, folding her favorite oversized sweater, when a soft knock came at her door. Before she could answer, it opened. Arthur stood there, his tie loosened, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at the canvas duffel bag on the bed, and a profound sadness washed over his face. "Packing for a vacation?" he asked quietly. "Going back to reality, Mr. Hoyer?" Sarah forced a smile, aggressively zipping a makeup bag. "Richard Harrington made some excellent points. You need stability for the IPO. The kids are doing great. They don't need a bodyguard anymore. They just need a regular, boring, highly educated nanny. And I need to figure out what I'm doing with my life." Arthur walked into the room, took the makeup bag out of her hands, and tossed it onto the armchair. "Do you know what I told Richard after you snuck away?" Arthur asked, his blue eyes locking onto hers. Sarah swallowed hard. "That you'd have HR draft my severance. I told him that if the board held a vote of no confidence, I would liquidate my majority shares, dissolve the firm, and start a new one by Monday morning," Arthur said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "And then I told him to get the hell out of my house." Sarah stared at him, stunned. "Arthur, you can't do that. That company is your life's work. You can't risk a multi-billion-dollar IPO over a nanny. You aren't a nanny, Sarah." Arthur stepped closer, entirely erasing the distance between them. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, electrified. "You haven't been just a nanny since the day you stood up to Victoria and took the blame for a remote control rat. You are the heart of this family. You are the only reason this house feels like a home. I don't care about Dumois. I don't care about the board. And I certainly don't care about Richard Harrington." He reached out, his hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch sent a jolt of lightning straight down her spine. "I care about you. Leo and Chloe care about you. We are not letting you go." "Arthur," Sarah breathed, her heart hammering wildly. The strict boundaries of employer and employee were dissolving, melting away into something terrifyingly real. "But," Arthur continued, a sharp, corporate glint returning to his eye, "I also don't believe in running from a fight. So, you aren't packing a duffel bag. You are putting on the most expensive dress you own. Because tonight is the Hoyer Hayes pre-IPO investor dinner at Le Bernardin, and you are coming with me. Not as staff, as my partner." 3 hours later, Sarah stepped out of the private elevator and into the lavish, dimly lit private dining room of Le Bernardin. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length emerald green silk gown, a gift Arthur had quietly arranged from Bergdorf Goodman months ago, waiting for the right moment. The room was packed with the titans of Wall Street. The moment Arthur walked in with Sarah on his arm, the conversation died. Richard Harrington, standing by the bar with the head of the Fidelity Acquisition team, looked as though he had swallowed a lemon. Arthur didn't flinch. He led Sarah through the room, introducing her seamlessly to billionaires and tech moguls. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Richard deliberately seated himself directly across from Sarah, flanked by a rigid, intimidating Swiss investor named Henrik Müller, who held the key to a massive block of the IPO funding. Throughout the appetizer course, Richard peppered Sarah with condescending questions, trying to expose her lack of Ivy League pedigree. "Tell me, Ms. Jenkins." Richard sneered loudly, drawing the attention of the table. "Arthur tells me you have quite the colorful background. Before you integrated yourself into the Hoyer household, what exactly was your area of expertise? Asset management, international relations." Sarah looked at Richard, feeling the weight of the entire room on her shoulders. She glanced at Arthur, who was watching her with total, unwavering confidence. He wasn't going to rescue her. He knew she didn't need it. "Actually, Richard," Sarah smiled, picking up her crystal wine glass. "I was an expert in high-stress crisis management, rapid-fire logistical coordination, and psychological de-escalation." Henrik Müller, the Swiss investor, raised an eyebrow, suddenly intrigued. "Impressive. Which firm?" "I ran the floor during the Sunday brunch rush at Sarabeth's on Central Park South." Sarah replied smoothly, her voice ringing out clear and unapologetic. A few executives chuckled nervously. Richard smiled triumphantly. A waitress. How charmingly rustic. It is, Sarah agreed, leaning forward. You learn a lot about people when they're hungry and entitled. You learn how to read a room. For instance, you learn how to memorize complex variables without writing them down. Which brings me to you, Mr. Muller. Henrik blinked, taken aback. Me. Yes, Sarah said. I read the prospectus Arthur left on his desk. Your firm in Zurich is heavily invested in rare earth minerals, specifically lithium extraction for EV batteries. You're hesitant about Arthur's new tech IPO because you think his hardware supply chain is overly reliant on unstable regions, correct? The entire table went dead silent. Arthur's eyes widened slightly, a massive, proud smile fighting to break across his face. Henrik Muller slowly set his fork down. That is precisely my concern. Yes, it is the primary reason we have not committed to the funding block. Well, Sarah continued, quoting the 70-page dossier she had casually read while waiting for the kids' laundry to dry. If you look at Section 4, Paragraph 2 of Arthur's revised logistics plan, you'll see he preemptively secured a 5-year exclusivity contract with a newly deregulated lithium mine in Western Australia. It completely bypasses the current supply chain bottlenecks you're worried about. It mitigates your risk entirely. Henrik stared at her. He looked at Arthur. Is this true, Arthur? It is. Arthur nodded, radiating pure smugness. Ms. Jenkins has an exceptional memory. Henrik burst into a booming, genuine laugh. He raised his glass to Sarah. A waitress. God in heaven. Arthur, your board told me you were slipping, but if this is the caliber of counsel you keep in your inner circle, you have my firm's full backing to the IPO. The table erupted in cheers and clinking glasses. Richard Harrington sat frozen, his face a pale, pasty white. He had tried to humiliate her, and instead she had just secured the anchor investor for a $10 billion deal between the salad and the main course. As the dinner wound down and the executives mingled, Richard quietly slipped out the side door, his power play utterly destroyed. Arthur pulled Sarah aside into a quiet alcove near the coat check. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded away. So, Arthur murmured, stepping into her personal space, his eyes dark and intense. Crisis management, huh? I aim to please, Sarah whispered, her breath hitching as Arthur's hands rested on her waist. You completely dismantled my senior board member. Arthur smiled, leaning in closer. It was the most terrifyingly attractive thing I have ever seen in my life. He didn't tip well, Sarah joked, though her voice trembled. I have a strict policy against bad tippers. Arthur didn't laugh. He looked at her with a vulnerability she had never seen in the ruthless CEO. Sarah, I meant what I said today. I don't want you as my employee. I want you as my equal. I want you with me. If you'll have me. Sarah looked into the eyes of the man who had changed her life, just as she had changed his. She thought of Leo's brilliant, chaotic mind, and Chloe's sweet, fierce loyalty. She thought of the family they had accidentally built from the wreckage of spilled iced coffee and broken rules. Arthur. Sarah smiled, reaching up to loop her arms around his neck. I think I can manage that. When Arthur finally kissed her, it was a promise that the wars were over. When they returned to the penthouse at midnight, They found the library door sealed shut with military-grade duct tape, and a note pinned to the center in Leo's neat handwriting. "We hacked the security cameras. We saw you kissing in the elevator. If you break up, we get the penthouse. L&C." Arthur laughed, resting his forehead against Sarah's. "Monsters. Absolute monsters." "They really are," Sarah agreed, leaning into his chest, entirely at peace. "But they're our monsters." The story of the Hoyer family is a testament to the fact that blood and money do not build a home. Resilience, boundaries, and genuine presence do. Sarah Jenkins walked into a billionaire's penthouse with nothing but a waitress's apron and a refusal to be intimidated, dismantling a cycle of psychological warfare that wealth had completely failed to solve. She didn't use degrees or textbooks. She used empathy, natural consequences, and street-smart grit to save 2 broken children from the wreckage of their parents' mistakes. In doing so, she forced a detached corporate titan to step up and become the father his children desperately needed. They proved that sometimes the most unqualified person on paper is the only one equipped to handle the reality of the human heart. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't a fairy tale. It was just the unstoppable force of someone who simply refused to walk away.